once you reach 95, you're screwed.
Well, that's a good word. I mean, we're going to censor you.
Thank you very much. On that note,
All
I'll
right.
leave.
All right. We now have the remainder of the time that we're going to give to Mr. Cardinale.
Oh, thank you. I wanted to actually see if you would be kind enough to let me talk for 10 minutes.
Well, you got 10 minutes.
Oh, so I didn't even have to ask. Thank you. And I know that you had pondered the possibility of going through the questions and answers from Bayhab. I think some of it is duplicative of the presentation, and some of the things I'm going to talk about anyway. So maybe we don't have to do both of those things. And but I did get with Mr. Tam to make sure that you all had a copy of these questions and answers.
We do.
Fabulous. Okay.
I'm going to skip out for a minute. I'll be right back.
Okay. All right. Well, on your way out, I just want you to know I'm very happy that Bayhab came, and I'm very happy that you all seem to have thought that it was beneficial information to this committee.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I would just piggyback on Ben Howard's comment. I would make a recommendation that when you all look at revising your recommendations, Bayhab, for the next bond issue, that we look at the 15-year and 30-year sunsets. It's just not enough time. And in response to the comment from Mr. Young, it's really about our affordable housing stock. And so, yeah, we want the person in that unit to be up and moving on and getting into a better home and all those things. But the affordability of that unit should be there for the next person who comes in, is my feeling. There was a question that I had raised about families paying more than 30% of their income towards housing, which according to HUD is housing cost burden. And I had spoken with Mr. Alexander about some of the down payment assistance, and in my questions to the Beltline, I had actually asked, how much are these mortgages? How much is the mortgage payment, and what is their income? And at first, he had said that there were at least 2 families that had opted to pay more than 30% of their income towards a mortgage payment, and I wanted to get Bayhab's opinion on that. So if you look at the answer to question number 9, is it acceptable to Bayhab that these families receiving trust fund funds would have housing cost burden? They actually answered no. So I think that's really important. Mr. Alexander and I had a conversation outside earlier today, and he said that he would get with me to provide the actual mortgage payment amount so we can get a clarity to this question, because nobody should be paying more than 30% of their income towards housing and then receiving city subsidy to do that. So that's that. I had also asked, and this is getting back to when Bayhab made their original recommendations, and one of the original recommendations, as I've discussed with this committee about like 12 times, was a 10% units targeted in any multifamily development for families making 30% AMI or below. And what happened was the Beltline and the ADA opposed it, and then the Bayhab ended up backing off and saying, well, we'll have it a scoring preference. So that's why what you saw in there wasn't a requirement, but a scoring preference. I want to go back to the requirement. So my recommendation, when you revisit your recommendations, requirement. But I was told that there was a conference call where a committee that had been set up by Bayhab had run through various funding scenarios, looking at the costs and then the revenue, to show why, according to the ADA and Beltline, it was so cost prohibitive and it would require so much subsidy. And I had asked whether they could come before this committee and run through those figures so you guys could actually see, because it's hard for me to fathom if 85% of the units are going to be market rate and another 5% at 60% AMI, why we can't ask developers or require developers to do 10% of the units at 30% AMI. And their answer to me, or in the email to me from Mr. Schneggenberger, said that he'd be willing to have a private meeting with me to run over those, and I'm happy to do that. I just think that after I see that, I'm going to be coming back to this committee and trying to share that with you. And I think that ultimately, when we have a lot of time ahead of us, ultimately I would like to see if they could come before this committee and run through some of those scenarios. It's not just about the Beltline. It's about Fort McPherson. It's about any affordable housing issue. If we can't settle this question of whether it's so cost prohibitive for developers to require 10% units at 30% AMI, then we're never going to have the answer. So I want to get that answer in a meaningful way. The 30% AMI, getting back to that original recommendation, and as you know, Michael Julian Bond, who's not here today, had made a request that Beltline Inc. explain their answer to that question, which I said was deceptive. What I think is interesting is, so here was the question. I said, why did the Beltline oppose the original BAHAB recommendation, which was to require 10% of affordable housing units in trust fund funded multifamily developments at 30% AMI? And they said originally BAHAB did not recommend the requirement referenced in the question above. But when I asked BAHAB the same question, which was why did the Beltline and the ADA
What's
oppose
that
that?
number, Mr. Cardinale?
Well, remember there were two sets of questions. So one was from the Beltline. I don't know if
Okay.
you have those in front of you. That's what I was reading from when they
Okay.
said BAHAB did not recommend the requirement. But if you look at in the BAHAB answers, number 11 on page 4, ABA and ADA disagreed with BAHAB's recommendation because they were concerned that this requirement would be cost prohibitive and slow the creation of units in a time frame that would be acceptable to bond investors. So we have the Beltline saying that the recommendation was never made, and we have BAHAB saying this is why they opposed the recommendation that we made. So there's some contradictory information here, and I just think that if information is going to be coming before this committee, it should be truthful, it should be accurate. And to me, they just didn't want to admit that they opposed this. Because, anybody who raises concerns about affordable housing in the Beltline, oh, don't worry, we have a trust fund, we have a plan, But when you get into the details, there was an attempt to have a requirement, it was opposed, and all I wanted this committee to understand was that happened. And why it happened, how it happened. And it's taken us 15 months to get to this point. But I think the documentation is now black and white that did happen, and that even though the Beltline denies it, that it did happen. I'm concerned about the lack of progress on multifamily developments. As you saw in the presentation, almost everything so far has been single-family homes, with 2 possible developments. We're not sure whether those are going to go through for multifamily, but we need to get more multifamily. And the recommendation that I had made to Mr. Schneggenberger, and what I want you all to think about. You remember they had like the 7, when they showed the progress to date, they had like 7 different categories of funding. So they started out with the bond issue, broke it down into maybe 7 categories. So there was $1 million here, $500,000 there, and so forth. And because we've had such a difficult time getting multifamily off the ground, my thought is when we do the next bond issue, instead of breaking it up into 7 pieces, if we could make sure that we have a piece for multifamily that's sufficient to complete a multifamily project with meaningful affordable units for those families making 30% AMI and 60% AMI. So that's something I hope that you all will consider. I'm also happy with the work that BAHAB is doing to establish a baseline, and from if I understand this correctly, they are working with the city to establish an affordable housing baseline, which is something that we need to do. We need to know what we have so we can figure out what we need and what we need to get there. Mr. Howard actually has a wonderful proposal that he's been talking about for some time, and I hope that council members will look at this very closely and carefully. The recommendation from Mr. Howard was for an affordable housing impact statement for any policy which would affect the total affordable housing stock in the city, to include a statement which would be similar to an economic impact statement. But this would be an affordable housing impact statement to say how this particular policy that we're looking at affects the total affordable housing stock in the city. And so I think if we're going to be looking to do a baseline, that we should be looking to look at anything that comes before us, how it relates. And before I relinquish the mic, I just wanted to see if we could get any answer to the contradictory statement that I spoke of a minute ago. And I know Michael Bond had requested that some explanation be given.
Is anybody willing to speak to that? Does anybody here have the wherewithal? And thank you, Mr. Cardinale. Wherewithal. I'm sorry. What did I say? I'm sorry.
Thanks for those comments. Just to clarify one issue, the initial answers that ABI provided to Mr. Cardinale spoke about recommendations related to 30% of AMI, and it really said that there were policy discussions about whether or not there should be a requirement related to 30% of AMI or a strong scoring preference, and that initially BAHAB concluded and recommended that there should be a strong scoring preference. That opinion of the board changed due to the desire to really create more units at 30% of AMI. ABI and the Atlanta Development Authority felt strongly that in order to make sure that these dollars were spent and that there was a level of flexibility, that it should be a strong scoring preference, and BAHAB ultimately agreed with that recommendation. In the document from BAHAB, you'll also see that their initial recommendation was for a strong scoring preference, and ultimately changed their recommendation to a requirement, and then ultimately accepted and agreed with ABI and ADA's recommendations. So the two documents are not inconsistent, and our position is consistent with BAHAB's position related to the recommendations for units at 30% of AMI. So we don't see any deceit there.
All right, last comment, Mr. Cardinale.
No, I just wanted to say thank you again for having BAHAB to come down today. And I look forward to this continuing conversation, especially those 7. I've been talking to you about how long about displacement mitigation, and you had it before your eyes today. So I'm glad that you're interested, and I hope that we'll have continuing conversations on each of those. Thank you.
All right. Let me see Ms. Edie and then Mr. Young.
Rakia Edie, Atlanta Beltline. I just want to remind the public and our advocates here that always come to CDHR about affordable housing in Atlanta Beltline, that the Beltline Affordable Housing Advisory Board is a public meeting, and it happens, the next meeting is September 13th at 3 o'clock at Atlanta Beltline offices. And the public can attend that, just so that that's another forum and venue.
September the 13th at what time?
September the 13th at 3 o'clock at Atlanta Beltline offices. And the public is open to attend anytime BAHAB hold a meeting and express any feedback to BAHAB directly.